Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. Along with me is my co-host, Rick Samuelson. Rick, good to see you.
Good to see you, sir. Merry Christmas.
The purpose of the Philosophical Angle is to analyze the nature and essence of concepts being used in current media. I am the author of 4 books in philosophy, one of which is the Defining Ethics, Good and Evil. Today's subject: in current media, there's talk about the budget deal of 2016, and a question of principles has come up, specifically the principles of the GOP. So, do the Republicans have principles? Is kind of a question mounting in front of the current media. So let's discuss that. So we've brought up let's go to a diagram and start a discussion here entitled "Principles of the Conservative Party." Well, the Republican Party. So you can see here on the screen, we're going to ask, do the Republicans have any principles? And the constituents, of course, they expect them to have principles. So before we start discussing whether the GOP has principles, let's discuss what is a principle. A principle is a piece of knowledge that is a priority that we established to prioritize how we treat others when we cooperate to their benefit. And this is an ethicality. So now we need to define ethics. So ethics is the situationally appropriate dispensation of respect. So when you respect your boss or your parents or your spouse or your relatives or your friend, you're treating them with the appropriate amount of respect that is due to them. And respect allows us to be able to cooperate with each other. It's anthropology, or the evolution, provided for the human animal to have respect, and the ability to respect allows the ability for the Homo sapien to cooperate. Thus, a principle is a priority of generating and performing the appropriate amount of respect, which is to the other's benefit. So let's take an example. An example of a principle would be that you pay your bills. You pay your bills because you're cooperating with somebody that essentially loaned you money and has given you a product or a service, and you have vowed to pay that person or company an appropriate amount of money, which is really a sign of respect that you value that product. And your payment to the person or company that holds that product or has given you the product is a sign of respect, and it is a principle that you hold, that you will adhere to in payment of your debt to that person or company. And so that payment is to the other person's benefit. And so that's the essence of a principle. Well, constituents of the Republican Party have certainly expect the Republican Party to have such principles. So what are these principles? Well, let's take some examples. Let's take first some examples of principles of the Democratic Party. Fairness and equality in outcome, except for the ruling class, of course, their exception to the case. But the Democrats have always, especially President Obama, is always talking about fairness. and equality. And because they have these principles of fairness and equality, they feel that the government is a good way to solve the society's problems of fairness and equality. Now, it should be noted that liberals feel that the individual is inherently not good and therefore cannot be trusted. And thus, because the individual cannot be trusted, this is why they prefer the government to be predominant in our society's problems, because their government is the great equalizer. So let's take an example of some of the principles of the Republican Party. First, the conservative believes that the individual is inherently good, and thus it doesn't feel that there's an overriding need for governments to be prevalent in all parts of our lives. So they tend to want limited government, and thus limited government means less government spending, free trade, less welfare, and so on. So let's see, let's take these examples one by one. For example, lowering taxes. So they like lower taxes, and did they receive that from the government, from the budget compromise of 2016? And clearly, no. There was no compromise or no lowering of taxes. So did they get less spending? No. They got more spending. So they acquiesced to the demands of the Democrat Party, which is in the minority yet. Still, they gave the Democratic Party more spending in the form of money for Syrian migrants who are mostly of military age and single-aged men, and I don't know why these guys are migrating to Europe and to the United States. They could be home fighting for their country and for their principles that they have there, but they've elected to exit and run. So, but free trade is another principle of the Republican Party, and yes, they did get some free trade. They got the free trading of petroleum, and so companies can now export petroleum internationally, which was previously not the case. So they got 2 out of 3 went against the principles of the Republican Party, or the principles of the constituents, and what they adhere as valuable, and they highly prioritize it in their political thinking. So their constituents kind of lost out here. They got a little bit on free trade, but they lost on spending, and they didn't get lower taxes, and the budget will be increased, and so they're angry. And was this deal worth it? Probably the constituents are saying no, and they would prefer to force the government into a cash flow government. Now, in the news media, everybody calls it a shutdown, a government shutdown. That's really a misnomer. It doesn't shut down the government; it just forces it to run on its daily cash flow, which is quite a bit. It gets quite a bit of revenue. It can operate just like anybody else in this world on its cash flow. So, what is the solution to this? The problem is that the Republicans are consistently going over to the Democratic side and always capitulating. And in this case, the excuse is to avoid a cash flow government of not being able to spend as much as the politicians wish to spend. Now, if this situation persists into the future, the national debt will be ever increasing. As we know, the national debt already has gone from 8 trillion to 16 trillion in the last 8 years or so. It's gone from approximately 40% of GDP to now in excess of 70% of GDP is the debt. So it's rising rapidly. Yet both parties have not this principle to force the government to run on cash flow. Yet the debt continues to pile up. So everybody knows, any private company, any private individual who runs a checkbook, who has to run on what they make, they know that eventually this kind of situation is heading for financial doom and kind of a financial Armageddon, so to speak. So what is the solution? Well, I can only see that the only solution, because the politicians on both parties can't help themselves to spend more. So I feel that I see no other way but that the states must step in and save the United States by calling for a constitutional convention to add amendments that would be able to control the spending of the United States. Now, I have read a book called The Liberty Amendments by Mark Levin, and that comes up with some suggestions for this constitutional convention to work with that would help solve this problem. And so, enough of me speaking. Let's go to Rick and see what he thinks about government spending, the debt, principles of the GOP, if there are any, and the situation. Rick, what do you think about this whole thing?
Well, I'm as alarmed as anyone else. On many fronts. I mean, where to begin with this? The disappointment I have in Speaker Ryan is hard to describe. I mean, he came in at least implicitly promising that he would draw a harder line than Mr. Boehner did with the Obama administration. That obviously is not the case. I think one implication of this and why it was so foolish at this juncture is that the establishment Republicans are driving their base into the Trump camp because it's become apparent that no establishment Republican, and there are a whole bunch running obviously, is going to change this dynamic, that the only chance for change is a radical departure. And Trump is perhaps the most radical, followed by perhaps Ted Cruz, maybe Rand Paul's, and so forth. So I would expect to see a bump up in the near future in the campaigns or the preference shown for the non-establishment politicians. So that's one thing. So I think the establishment Republicans, if they think that they're kind of getting away with something here, I'm afraid this is going to come back to bite them in the presidential nomination and also with their own races. You may find in 2016 that there are even more Tea Party candidates that uh, challenge incumbent Republicans. And that could, who knows what's going to happen with that. But it's not inconceivable that the Republican Party may lose a few seats in the House as well as the Senate because of this infighting. So it's a remarkably short-sighted strategy, to my way of thinking, from a political point of view. As for the idea of a constitutional convention, I have already met with a guy by chance at a recent political event who's helping to push that whole concept forward in the state of Washington. I think it's, even if it's not practically doable, I think it would send, the more it progresses, the more it sends the message to the federal government that the electorate are extremely unhappy and willing to consider radical measures to bring government spending under control and government policies under control in a way that is consistent with protecting and nurturing American citizens. So I think it's a great idea.
What do you think about the government, the present political decision by the Republicans to avoid I hate using this word, government shutdown, but the media uses it all the time. I really prefer to call it a cash flow government. So to avoid a cash flow government, they made this deal. Is that really something that they should be considering? In other words, is it something that has to be avoided at all costs by any politician from either party?
Well, I think there's some history there, right? The Republicans always get blamed when there's a quote-unquote government shutdown, and Obama uses that dynamic, quite ruthlessly. What's troubling is that even if there has to be some room for compromise in order to avoid a high-profile shutdown, what appears to have happened is that the Republicans have, rather than negotiating, they've simply caved in. Because, as you rightly point out, the only conservative win in all of this is lifting the oil embargo on exporting oil. And so that just seems way out of whack for busting all the spending caps, allowing funding actually Syrian immigration. I mean, it's a very lopsided deal, and it appears as if their negotiating ability is next to nothing.
Right. So, and obviously the constituents really are angry about it. So why not force the government into a cash flow situation? Over time, I think the American people would recognize that it's not such a big deal, that everything operates as it pretty much as it should. But what do you think? Do you think there would be a political backlash against the Republicans so severe that they would again lose in the 2016 presidential election and in the congressional elections? Would it be so bad? Or would it be good? Maybe the country would recognize that what they're doing, and really they, of course, have to countermand the criticisms with their own positive story to the American people. They can't just sit back and say nothing.
Well, this is a tricky one because of the timing. We're in a presidential election cycle. I'm guessing, and this is strictly speculation, that what's going on in Paul Ryan's head is that, okay, we give in to what Obama wants. We win the presidential election. We retain control of the Senate and the House. And then we can do what we want. Now, the problem is that what they want to do is not necessarily consistent with conservative principles. I don't believe the establishment Republicans are going to shrink the government. I don't think it's a priority. I think they may dress it up as a priority, but the establishment Republican Party is a party of big government. It's not a party of limited government. It's a long way from being the Tea Party.
So, is a third party perhaps the only way out for the Tea Party? Or should they still operate within the Republican Party?
Well, again, that's a tricky question because a split vote would definitely consign the conservative movement to minority status. There just aren't enough conservatives in the country, and as long as the Democrats remain as united as they are, and as firm in pursuing their agenda, I think the better practical strategy at the moment, now that this has happened, is to win the next presidential election, try to retain the majorities, and I fear there will be some erosion because of what has just happened. So certainly the congressional majority will be eroded. The Democrats will win back likely some seats on account of this.
Now, why would they win back some seats? Why would the erosion happen?
I think you're going to find that some Republicans, some conservatives stay at home and don't vote.
Okay.
We've seen that before.
Right. And has any of the presidential candidates, as far as you know, made any issue of this particular problem yet?
Both Rand Paul and Ted Cruz have.
Okay.
Rand Paul is very vociferous in condemning it, but the most vociferous, and then followed by Ted Cruz.
Okay. Has Trump mentioned anything that you know, that you've heard?
I haven't seen anything from him, but that doesn't mean he hasn't said something about it.
Okay. So overall, is Ryan's strategy overall efficacious for the Republican Party? Did he do the right thing pragmatically? Maybe philosophically he didn't, but pragmatically, did he do the right thing? What do you think?
I think he could have negotiated much more cleverly. I just can't see why he would give away so many of Obama's priorities for simply the ability to export oil, which at an economic level, at the moment, is really not going to help American oil producers.
Perhaps they just, Obama and the Democratic leadership probably just stood pat, didn't probably say very much, and let it go into a cash flow government, knowing that this is not what the Republicans want to do presently. They really wouldn't have to do much. All they'd have to do is just stand pat and wait for the Republicans to cave in. I think that's probably what happened. What do you think?
I honestly don't know, but you could well be right.
Because they were.
Go ahead.
They were gloating at the consummation of this vote. They were kind of giving themselves the pat on the back.
Well, rightly so.
They got everything. Right.
Yep.
So, now on the other side of the ledger, what do you suppose the Democrats can say, going into the 2016 election, of any criticism to the Republicans over this? Oh, perhaps you are budget busters, or perhaps you are spending too much, and we are the party of fiscal responsibility. Can they say that?
Well, they can't say that, but they can say that fiscally there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats, and that's legitimate. That's a legitimate criticism.
Okay, so what's going to be the defining policies and criticisms going into the election 11 months from now?
Well, to the extent the Democratic Party is the party of Santa Claus, there will be new entitlements on offer. There's already talk of free tuition at public universities from Mrs. Clinton. And there will be other such goodies that the Democrats love to distribute to the electorate in quantity. And more will be promised than can be delivered, but it's all going to sound very, very good if you're keen on getting yet another entitlement. And many voters are. Let's be honest.
Right.
Perhaps. Whereas the Republicans can offer some of those things, but they'll never go to the extreme that the Democrats do.
So really, the defining issues. What's that?
To that extent, there's some difference between the Republican establishment party and the Democratic establishment party.
Well, I can name some others too. Of course, immigration is going to be a defining moment for the in the coming months, and international foreign policy. On that front, there is a clear distinction between the two parties.
Well, and I would add, if, as is likely, there's another one or two terrorist incidents in the United States, all of the Republican establishment candidates will tank.
Okay, right. So the Trump, the Cruz, and will be in the lead still.
Yeah, and I think Rand Paul could pick up some ground too.
Now, why is that? Isn't his foreign policy a little on the weak side?
It is, but he's very strong on immigration.
In what manner?
Well, he's very severe when it comes to any talk of the Syrian refugees coming to the United States. He's also very strong on limiting other types of immigration, and he's dead set against any kind of amnesty. So he's the other one that could get a bump up. But any of the conventional guys, if there are another couple of terrorist incidents, Bush will be gone. He'll disappear, actually.
Okay.
From view.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to thank you.
Well,
I want to thank you very much. We're just about out of time, and we'll see you next week on the Philosophical Angle.
All right.
Join us then. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.